Assassins, to another episode of the Dark Assassins podcast, the show that dives deep into not just technology, but the concepts, software, and procedures behind it all, and explains it so simply that even your grandma can understand it. As always, I'm your host, the Dark Assassin. So the topic for this episode actually kind of comes from a conversation I was having this past week where I was running a backup job with my backup script that I've mentioned multiple times on the podcast, and in case you're wondering, it still works. But I was talking about this idea of the way that I back up my NAS is that I archive everything and compress it into a single tar.gz or tarball file, and then export that off my NAS onto my Xserve as a way to back it up, since as of right now I don't technically have a off-site backup solution, which I know is terrible. I preach you should have an off-site backup, but I currently really don't have one, so if my house burns down, RIP. But in fairness, I am planning on addressing that. I've been doing some research into potential solutions for that, and I plan on trying to figure something out over the next few weeks or months or what have you, but that is coming down the pipeline. But anyway, back to the archiving and stuff. So I got to talking about, just kind of some basics of, how like compression works and whatnot. And the person I was telling it to, my mom, so which I'm assuming she's probably listening. So hi, Mom. She was wondering if I had done an episode on compression, and I was like, I don't think I have. So here we go. We're going to be talking about compression today in this episode, so be sure to strap in and get ready for that. But before we do, let's get into this week's trivia question. And on the topic of compression, the zip file format is one of the most common types of compression files that's out there. You'll see these on Windows, Mac OS, Linux, basically everywhere. Zip files are everywhere. And this week's trivia question is, what year was the zip file format released? So what year was the zip file format released? And that is your trivia question for the week. Now, I can't believe that I'm actually going to give this the time of day, but seeing all of the videos I've seen pop up and the podcasts that I listen to that it's been talked on, people seem to be really up in arms on both sides about good old Elon's latest decision to change the name of Twitter to X. So in case you didn't know, Elon recently changed Twitter to X, and basically throughout this whole process, obviously I don't use Twitter or X, I guess. I have no skin in the game. I have absolutely really no opinion what happens here because I could honestly care less. But hearing all of the people's opinions on this just really kind of showed me that, man, some people really have a serious social media addiction. Now, I think it's fair to say that I think it's generally pretty well known at this point that social media sites such as Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, all of the various social media platforms are meant to be addictive. Like, their intended purpose is to be addictive, so you stay on the platform as long as possible so you can see as many ads as possible, so the company that owns said platform can make as much money as possible. And there's been even research shown that like internal research from companies like Facebook and Instagram that show that their platforms are addictive, and they keep it that way because that helps their bottom line, helps their shareholders, yada, yada, yada. So it's kind of well known that social media addiction is a thing, and that's kind of what it's designed for. But it was definitely really on display, I think, the past week and a half or however long it's been since this decision happened, that some people are seriously addicted to it. Because I'll tell you what, it's honestly sounded like group therapy sessions on some of these videos and podcasts that I listened to, where they were just only talking, about Twitter and I guess X, if we're calling it that now. I don't know. But it kind of sounded like a group therapy session, because they were all like, affirming each other that like, yeah, this is stupid, or why do people care? It's just a name, or, whatever side they were on. Because on the one hand, you had the Twitter fanboys that were mad at Elon because he changed the name to X. And on the one hand, Twitter fanboys, I agree with you. I think the name change is pretty dumb. But as I said, I could honestly care less because I never use the platform anyway. And then on the other hand, you have the Elon fanboys that are basically telling the Twitter fanboys to chill out, because after all, it's just a name, so who really cares? It's the same platform. And then you have the Twitter fanboys firing back, being like, yeah, it's just a name, so why bother changing it? And because you're changing it, you're killing the whole brand name of Twitter in the process. And I really don't know what to say about this, but like, I could honestly care less. But the funny thing is, or at least I find it kind of funny, is I'm supposedly part of this younger generation that is supposedly, quote, addicted to their phones and addicted to social media. But at the same time, I can't tell you how many times that I have been the only person that is not glued to my phone in a given space. Like, generally speaking, if I'm out in public, I am not on my phone, for a couple of reasons. One of them being, I don't really want, I guess it's called shoulder surfers is I guess the term, or basically like you're on your phone or you're on your computer doing something and someone's kind of looking over your shoulder to see what you're looking at. I like my privacy. I like not having people get all up in my business like that. So that's one of the reasons why I don't do it. The other reason I'm generally not on my phone is kind of going back in that same vein. Like, the internet's a wild place. If I'm scrolling through, like some web page or some social media app or whatever, I don't know what I'm going to see. And depending on what I see, that could be kind of weird for, someone in the public to see, like, I don't know what kind of weird ads some random website's going to show me. Like, I'd rather not have to deal with that. But anyway, I can't tell you how many times I've seen, as the kids these days would call them, boomers, or older folks, are like absolutely glued to their phones. Like, sometimes, like, I kid you not, I have gone walking before, and I literally could have straight up walked into someone and like plowed them over, and they wouldn't have even known, because they were literally just glued, eyes down at the phone they didn't even look up, like, the entire time that they were out walking. And I was like, my goodness, geez, y'all. Like, I get, like, you're outside and that's step one, but I think we're just going to move on at this point, because I'm kind of at a loss for words. And if you're like me and you've been hearing about all this stuff for the past week, you're probably sick of it too. So we're just going to move on with this week's cybersecurity tip. So for this week's cybersecurity tip, this one is going out to all of the home labbers out there and all of those dealing with infrastructure, specifically server infrastructure, whether you're in IT, whether you're doing DevOps, whatever the case may be. If you're managing servers, this cybersecurity tip is for you. And especially if you have anything that is public facing, such as you're running something in the cloud or you have a server that's facing the public internet. And that is, you should make sure that you harden your SSH connections, specifically using SSH keys and disabling the use of passwords. Now, I think it's safe to say that it's no secret that passwords generally aren't the best when it comes to security. Now, there's obviously a lot of rules in place to improve the security of passwords, making them have to be a certain number of characters with, special characters thrown in there, uppercase letters, numbers, special characters, all that stuff to make the passwords harder to randomly guess. But at the end of the day, as we've discussed in the podcast before, there are things like rainbow tables that hackers can use, which are basically passwords that are pre-linked to hash values, so they can just do a lookup of the hash values and know what the password is. There are other dictionary attacks where they can run all of the various passwords in the dictionary through the hashing algorithm to get outputs and compare those against, passwords that they found in data breaches and whatnot. So passwords, generally, if you can use something stronger like public key encryption, like what SSH keys use, that's generally the better way to go, because as of right now, since quantum computers aren't really a thing, RSA-style public key encryption schemes are secure. Now, obviously, once quantum computers really come onto the scene, that's not really going to be the case anymore, but for what it's worth as of right now, using SSH keys to log in to your servers is definitely the way to go. Plus, if you're using SSH keys to log into your servers, you don't have to worry about even using a password and typing anything in. You literally just can SSH and then, the username and host name or IP address or domain or however you log in, and then you're just logged in, because the SSH key authentication, basically how it works is you give the server your public key, and then in the process of you connecting, you basically do a handshake, and because you have the private key, theoretically anyway, you're the only person that should have said private key, so that's how you authenticate yourself, and you don't have to worry about providing a password or anything, because you have the private key, which is the way that you authenticate yourself. Now, another thing that you should also be doing to harden your SSH port is to disable access to the root user to log in via SSH. So you should not be able to log in as root into a machine via SSH. Now, that's not to say that, you can't have any user have root privileges. You just shouldn't be able to log in as root into the system. And I think it should be kind of obvious why you don't want that to happen, because if you log in as root, by default, anything you type happens. Any command you execute runs without any confirmation of if you want to do it or not. Now, if you're just a regular user and you have root privileges, if you try to run something as root or run a command that needs root privileges, you'll have to be prompted for a password or some other kind of form of authentication in order to actually perform that action. So, an additional level of security there. So you don't want attackers having that, easy street access of guessing the root password, getting in as root, and being able to do whatever they want to your machine. So this is another reason why you shouldn't have passwords enabled for your SSH connections, because then even if they knew the root password, they wouldn't even be able to log in anyway, because passwords are disabled. And similarly, in that same vein, if you just completely disable the ability for the root user to log in, then that's another hole that you patched, because you're denying another way that an attacker could get in. And the reason why I say this is especially something you should do if you have a public-facing infrastructure, like something in the cloud, is because anything that's accessible on the public internet, you're going to have constant attacks of people trying to get into your machine. And if you want to see this for yourself, I wouldn't recommend doing it with a device on your home network, but if you wanted to spin up a VM in the cloud or something, by all means go ahead and do that, and then just let it sit there for a few weeks or a month or so, and then look at the SSH logs. Look at the logs of how many times some random IP address or something tried to log into your server via SSH. You're gonna be kind of spooked by how many times someone tried to log into your machine. So by not allowing passwords at all, that is definitely an amazing way to improve the security of the system, and obviously denying the ability for root to log in is another awesome way, because a lot of the times when people are trying to log into your server via SSH, they're trying to log in as root for obvious reasons. So disabling the root user and disabling passwords and only allowing SSH keys is definitely what you should be doing. For me personally, I only have one machine that's in the cloud, which I use as a VPN and an external DNS server, and that, as you can guess, root user is disabled, and the only way that I can log into it is via SSH keys. So if I ever want to add a new device in order to be able to log into that from another device, basically what I have to do is I have to manually, from a device that's already authenticated, copy the the new device's public SSH key over, and then I can log in from the device, which is a little bit more of a hassle. But as we've talked about on the podcast, the more secure something is, generally the more hoops and steps you have to go through in order to actually be able to accomplish the task you want. So there is that trade-off, obviously, but it is definitely something that you should be doing, and that is your cybersecurity tip for the week. Now, if you've been listening to the podcast for the past few episodes, you're probably wondering what the heck happened to my home lab, because I really haven't talked about it much at all the past few weeks. I've been really caught up on my various programming projects, but that changes this week. And I guess with that, we're just rolling right on into what nerdy stuff have I been up to this week. So this week, the first thing that I guess we can talk about is, I mentioned, I believe in last week's episode, how I created Docker containers for my personal websites, and I was planning on trying to work that into a CI/CD pipeline to, auto-create the Docker containers and auto-deploy them. So I got the first few steps of that accomplished this week. So the first thing that I had to do was I had to create a GitLab runner. So I have a personal self-hosted instance of GitLab running in my house, and in order to use CI/CD pipelines, I have to have a GitLab runner. Now, if you're using just the gitlab.com, the main GitLab site, you probably don't really need to have your own runner unless you're doing something, super specific. You can just use the ones provided by GitLab. Now, you do have to be careful with that, because depending on which what tier you're in, specifically the free tier. You're limited to how many minutes that you can run in a given time window, so that is something you have to be cautious about. But obviously, if you're self-hosting it, there's no limit. But regardless, even if you do use GitLab.com, the main GitLab site, you can host your own runners and have the projects run on your own runners. But that's kind of besides the point. So basically, since I'm self-hosting it, obviously I needed a GitLab runner. So I created that, which allowed me to run my CI/CD pipelines. Plus, it's on my own hardware, so I know nothing is being saved, and everything's all good there. It's all local and internal. And I did actually manage to get a basic CI/CD pipeline set up. So what will happen is I can just, whenever I commit my changes and push them to my internal GitLab server, it will automatically build the Docker container and push that Docker container to the internal container registry on the GitLab my internal GitLab site. So then on any machine on my network, I could easily just pull that container down and be ready to go. Now the next step that I want to try to implement, I haven't really looked into it too much yet because I got this win and I wanted to savor it a little bit, I guess. Plus, as we'll see, I got into other things as well. But the next thing I kind of want to do is, so I got the container building and adding to the registry every time I push my changes, but I'm not automatically deploying it. So I got part of the DevOps thing going there, part of the CI/CD pipeline, but I don't have the deployment, right? I'm not deploying it anywhere. So that's going to be the next thing that I plan on looking into with that. Now, another thing home lab related is I may or may not have bricked my Grafana dashboard that I use for monitoring my servers and my internet connection. And when I say I may or may not have, I'm pretty sure we all know that I totally bricked that thing. So basically what happened here was I was trying to update the Docker containers on my server that runs all my Docker containers. And in the process of doing that, I thought I was being slick by modifying one of the Docker Compose files that held the database functionality for monitoring my individual servers through IPMI. And I thought I was being slick, being able to modify which image it was pulling down, and that caused basically everything to break. Now, it still had all the queries and everything in there, but it failed to connect to the database and wasn't able to pull anything and just caused all kinds of errors. So here is another fantastic instance where I, a code monkey, occasionally break stuff in my home lab. Now, I did manage to get it working again. I basically removed my what I thought was genius IQ move of updating the image back to what it was originally, and surprise, surprise, doing that fixed the issue. Because if it ain't broke, don't fix it. That's a saying out there. So I probably should have took that advice and not even messed with it in the first place. But now I know, I guess. Now, in addition, speaking of Docker and updating my containers, one thing that with Docker that is a little annoying, to me anyway, is when you run your generic system updates, Docker does not update in the sense that your containers don't update unless you manually update them. So even if you have your containers set to restart automatically, they don't automatically pull down the new versions of containers and essentially rebuild them to automatically update themselves on restart. Now, Granted, I am no Docker expert, so there is maybe some way that you can do that in your Docker Compose file or whatever that will automatically pull down the latest versions of the images if needed and manually do the updates that way so you don't have to worry about it. But if that is a thing you can do, I am not aware of it, at least as of right now. So what I decided to do was I decided to write a script to automatically do it for me. And the way I wrote this script was I made it configurable through like an XML style file where you can basically put in the location to all the various folders where you have your Docker Compose files. Or Docker files to build your Docker containers, and it'll go through each one of those folders and do the process of updating, pulling down the new images, removing any dangling or old images that it no longer needs anymore, rebuilding any Docker containers that it needs that you have Docker files for that you want to be rebuilt. You can specify that in the config file. And then it'll bring all the containers back up and do that all manually and do that all automatically. All you have to do is run the script and make sure your config file is right. And the reason why I wanted to have the config file was I have the server at my house that runs Docker containers. But the server I mentioned that I have in the cloud also is running Docker containers. So being able to not have to worry about changing the script and only having to modify the config file was definitely the move and the reason why I went that route. Now, obviously, I could not be bothered to do the peasant work that is to manually log into each one of these servers and run the script. That is obviously way too much effort for a lazy code monkey like myself. I'm not about to do that peasant work. No. And as you might be able to guess if you listen to the podcast for a while, you know that I am a pretty big fan of Ansible when it comes to managing my infrastructure and my servers. So naturally, what I did was I wrote an Ansible playbook to do this automatically for me. But again, having to run a single Ansible playbook just to update my Docker containers in addition to running an Ansible playbook to update all my servers was again too much work because that's now 2 commands that I have to type in to update my servers. And that's just way too much work. So naturally, what I did was I integrated that Ansible playbook to update my Docker containers and included that into my, master Ansible playbook for updating servers. So now this Ansible playbook that updates all my servers now updates all the Pi-hole instances. It updates my Bitwarden containers because that has its own methodology of how to update stuff. There's an include, I believe it's a .sh, I believe it's a shell script that does all that for you. So that's included in the update script. Now I have updating all my Dockers included in the update script. I have updating just in general all the servers, removing any packages that need to be removed, checking if you need to reboot the systems and rebooting them. So it is a absolute lazy guy's masterpiece because literally all I do, and to make this even better, by the way, I have a bash alias assigned, so I don't even have to bother typing in Ansible playbook. First, navigating to the directory and then typing Ansible playbook and then, the name of the playbook. I don't even have to do that. I can just type in update servers, hit enter, and watch the magic happen. And you know what? If I don't even want to watch the magic happen because I don't want to see it and I want to go do other stuff, I can type update servers BG for background and it'll run the process in the background. I can close out of the terminal, be on my merry way, and all of my servers will update and do what they need to do. All the output will be written to a log file, and I can check that at my leisure. If you've never used Ansible before and you have a home lab, in my honest opinion, you are seriously missing out, because it definitely makes your life a heck of a lot easier. But that's not where the home lab stuff for me stopped this week, because another thing I did was I call it a reverse proxy, but in all reality, it's really not. It's basically just a glorified forwarding service, because if you've done stuff with like Docker containers and other various services like Plex or Jellyfin or something like that use port number, that have web portals, but they don't use port 80 or 443, which is HTTP and HTTPS respectively, which is just the default port numbers for those protocols. That you have to manually type in those port numbers in order to get to the site you want. And if you're trying to use DNS, or the domain service system, so rather than typing in an IP address, you can just type a human readable name. So rather than like 192.168.1.55 colon, I guess it's 32400, I think is Plex. Rather than typing in that nonsense, you would just type, Plex dot something dot, say you have a internal domain dot local dot net, say. So you could instead just type plex dot local dot net. The problem is DNS doesn't allow you to specify port numbers. So you can't do that unless you have some kind of proxy or forwarding service kind of set up, which is basically what I did here. So what I did was I set up what I called a reverse proxy, but again, it's really just forwarding, because literally what it does is if you type in, say, plex.local.net, it will receive that request, see the domain name is plex.local.net, and then just forward you to the appropriate IP address and port of my Plex server. Same thing for Jellyfin, same thing for my various Docker containers and whatnot. It'll just automatically forward you to that site, to that IP address. And it's really obvious because unlike a reverse proxy server where the domain name actually stays in the title bar, the title bar just gets completely changed to whatever the IP address of the device that I'm trying to connect to is. So it's not a actual reverse proxy, but it kind of sort of serves the same purpose. And honestly, it's good enough for me since I can type in the domain names now rather than having to remember all the various port numbers. And for me, that was a pretty big win. And another very big win that I had was I got all of my Proxmox hypervisors updated to Proxmox VE8. So there's a new version of Proxmox out. I believe it came out, I want to say back in June, I believe, whenever Debian 12 came out. So Debian 12 came out back in June of this year. Debian 12 Bookworm is the name of it. So it came out in June, and to my surprise, my hypervisors all updated without issues, which, seeing that it is my home lab and I occasionally break stuff, I was kind of expecting something not to go totally according to plan, but thankfully it did. Now, I did toil with the idea of writing an Ansible playbook to automatically update all my hypervisors at once and just, full send it and not have to worry about it. But I decided against that for a couple reasons. Now, it wouldn't have been the end of the world because I had recently run backups for all of my VMs, so I had fresh backups of all my VMs. So in the event that one of the updates would have completely bricked one of my hypervisors and I would have had to reinstall Proxmox, I could have easily recovered all those VMs back by restoring the VMs from the backup. So it wouldn't have been a huge deal, but also at the same time, I'd rather not spend probably in all reality multiple days restoring I don't even know, over 20, 25. I have a problem. I have way too many VMs, way too many servers, way too many services, but that's besides the point. It would have taken a while to restore all that, so ideally, I would have liked to avoid that if possible, which I did, and taking the more cautious route of making sure everything was going according to plan, carefully, looking at the various options that it, brought up in the update process, as far as, do I want to change this file, or do I want to keep my local version or take the newer version, and all that stuff. I wanted to make sure things went according to plan. So that was definitely an undertaking, but I'm happy that I managed to get all those updated to the latest version, so that was a big win. So now getting into kind of the preamble for our talk on compression. So I mentioned at the very beginning of this episode that the reason for talking about compression kind of came up because I was running my backup script to archive my NAS. And boy, oh boy, was that a good thing I did that, because RAID basically saved my NAS. Little off topic, little tangent here. But as a quick refresher of what RAID is the redundant array of independent or inexpensive, depending on who you ask, disks. And basically what this allows you to do is combine multiple disks together to basically look like one disk to the operating system. And it can offer things like redundancy, or being able to lose a disk and not lose any of your data, and or improve the overall write speed of your array or disk in this case. So if you have, say, 4 disks, and depending on how you set up your RAID, you can get significantly faster speed performance in your reads and writes, depending on how you configure it, compared to just one drive. So that's brief recap on what RAID is, but as the obligatory comment when you're talking about RAID is not a backup, so you actually should have a legitimate backup. Now, RAID saved me because I mentioned earlier again in the podcast that I was looking into some possible offsite backup solutions, and one of those solutions, well, there's a couple, solutions, but they basically allow you block storage essentially, and through TrueNAS, you can basically sync to these, cloud solutions. And I was trying to look into, basically how I would go about doing that. And in the process of doing that, I obviously had to log into my TrueNAS server, which is my NAS. And I noticed that it said that my array was degraded, which is not good. It is less than ideal. And I saw that one of the drives had faulted. And coincidentally, I believe it faulted on the day that I was running my backup script, which I don't think is necessarily a coincidence. But anyway, if I didn't have RAID, if I didn't have my NAS set up in a RAID array, I probably would have lost my entire NAS during that process of doing the backup. Oops. But because the backup was completed and I have that copy, I'm really not that worried if the NAS decides to kick the bucket before the new hard drives that I frantically ordered to replace the dead one or faulted one arrive. So that will definitely be a process. I'll get to experience what rebuilding a RAID array is like, so that should be fun. But the reason why I kind of bring this up was this is kind of where the idea of compression came in. And my backup script, it compresses all the files on my NAS into a single archive file and then offloads it to my Xserve. That's my current solution for backing up my NAS. But in all reality, I say it compresses it, but if you look at the size of the compressed file versus the total size of data on the NAS, they're basically the same, which I don't think is necessarily that big of a surprise, because the majority of the data on my NAS is things like backing up my pictures from my phone, backing up my media library, backing up all the VMs that are backed up from Proxmox. And all these things are already pretty darn compressed. And seeing that that's the largest portion of the data on my NAS, it's not necessarily that much of a surprise that there really isn't much compression going on, because if you try to compress something that's already compressed, you're really not going to see much of an improvement when it comes to file size. Now, I think that's a great segue into talking about compression. So when it comes to compression, there's a couple main types, I guess you could say, when it comes to like file types. So obviously, probably your most common one is your .zip or your zip files. Another one is 7-zip or .7z is what the file extension is. And then another one is .rar files. Those are, I think, more commonly on Windows rather than like Mac OS and Linux. And then you have tar and gzip. Those are usually kind of combined together to be your tar.gz. Those are definitely more common on Linux-based systems, although you can also see those on Mac OS as well. And rarely will you see them natively on Windows, mainly because I don't believe Windows really has out-of-the-box support for tar.gz files. I think now I'm pretty sure if you download, like, say, the 7-zip program, you'll be able to extract tar.gz files. But generally, those are more for like Linux machines and Unix-based systems and whatnot. So when we talk about compression, I'm obviously not going to go over every single compression algorithm and every single form of compression, because quite honestly, we'd be here for probably the next year, month, I don't know, we'd be here a while, because there's a lot. And I'm sure you could honestly probably take like an entire course in college specifically for compression, because that's just how big of a scope this is. And you could probably even do your PhD on it if you really wanted to. Obviously that I'm not doing that, but I mean, that's something you could probably do if you were interested. So I guess one thing that we should start with is, let's just start with a couple super basic examples of compression in action and kind of give you a sense of how it works. So a super basic example will specifically apply to text, because I think applying compression to text is kind of the easiest to visualize and understand, rather than diving head into how do I convert this movie file, this from, the raw film from the camera, and how do I convert that down from however many hundreds of gigabytes or however big the file is down to like 5 gigabytes, or I don't know, I'm making these numbers up, right? Like, how do you compress like movie files? I think that's not as easy to understand as compressing text. So we're going to start there. So the first method that I can just kind of come up with off the top of my head when it comes to compressing text is basically replacing duplicates. So in this case, assume you have any instance where you have more than 2 letters in a given sequence. So say, for example, you have 4 A's. What you can do is, rather than typing out 4 A's, you could just do like A and then the number 4. And then you compressed 4 characters down to 2. So that's a super basic version of compression. Obviously, that algorithm probably would be pretty bad, because I don't think there's a whole lot of instances in the English language specifically where you would have a lot of repeat letters in a row like that you could actually make use of this, unless I guess maybe you're doing like text messages of like super enthusiastic people where they add like a bunch of letters at the end of their words or something. So obviously you probably won't really see much compression through this method, but this is a super basic method that you could pretty easily write a program to do for you if you wanted to, and just a super basic compression algorithm where you take multiple, and the reason why you'd want to do two or more than two is because if you say have two A's, if you change two A's to A2, you still have two characters, so you don't really save any space, so it's really not worth doing. Now, a more advanced approach to this would be doing a lookup table index or a dictionary approach. Now, this approach basically kind of, I guess you could say, exploits the English language in a way. So basically the idea here is I guess there's a couple methods to it. The first and more universal, if you will, is to basically take the most common words, say in the English language, like the, be, to, of, etc., the most common words, and you basically assign them a number. And then whenever you see that word in the text you're trying to compress, you replace that word with the number. So a basic example here, if you take now I guess back up a step, other super common words are the word A, which is, just the letter A, and I, or the letter I. And obviously this really wouldn't work that well in these cases because you're replacing one character with one character. And obviously it would be even worse if your ID for the index for, say, the word A was like 10, because then you actually just made it worse by adding two characters for one. So you'd have to be careful on how you assigned your indexes and your IDs. But if we take, say, the play of Macbeth, if you run that through a word counter, you'll find that the word the and are the top two most common words in the entire play, appearing 534 and 410 times respectively. So if you were to assign, say, the and the IDs of 1 and 2, and because the number 1 and number 2 would take up 1 byte, and the word the and are 3 characters, which would be 3 bytes, basically what you would do is, since you're compressing, every time you see the word the, you replace it with a 1, and every time you see the word and, you replace it with a 2. You would take this 534 word plus 410 word, add those together, multiply it by 3 because each word has 3 characters or 3 bytes. That would give you 2,832 bytes combined for every instance of the and. And because you replaced those instances of the and with the numbers 1 and 2, which are each 1 character or 1 byte, you reduce that 2,832 bytes down to just 944 bytes. So a pretty good reduction in size for that compression. Now, another way you could also do this is, generally you're probably going to run into the same instance here because how common the word the is. But another way that you could also do this lookup is you basically would have to read through the entire text you're trying to compress and find the most common words, and then you could dynamically assign the indexes that way to the most common words. Now, obviously, this would take more processing power because you'd first have to scan the entire text that you're trying to compress, not to mention it would also use a lot more memory because you'd have to be dynamically keeping track of, the most common words and whatnot. So it wouldn't necessarily be as fast as using a common lookup table of the most common words in the English language. But at the same time, depending on what kind of text you're trying to compress, you would be able to see size-wise, you'd be able to get much better results because theoretically you could be, depending on the text you're trying to see, you might have some more complex words that would show up more frequently than, say, the more common words in the English language. So that is potentially another option you could do for your compression. And this idea of kind of a lookup table index thing or a dictionary approach is actually the approach commonly used in the LZ adaptive dictionary-based algorithm, where LZ stands for Lempel-Zeev. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Where that algorithm is used to shrink files where you replace the most common words with numbers. So basically the example that we just described. So the example we just described is actually a commonly used algorithm when it comes to compression. Now, you can actually take this a step further if you want to get more complex with your compression algorithm, where rather than just replacing individual words, you replace phrases with numbers. So if you have a lot of very common phrases throughout the text you're trying to archive, you could replace the phrases rather than just the individual words. So if, for instance, you have a text with a lot of dialogue in it, and you have a lot of he said or she said or they exclaimed or, something like that, very common phrases, you could replace each one of those with an index, and then which would even further compress your file size because now you're taking multiple words, so even more characters than just a single word, and compressing it down to a number, which would significantly reduce the number of bytes and thus add even more compression and make an even smaller file size. Now, so far up to this point, the kinds of compression that we've been talking about is known as lossless compression. And this is a type of compression that, in other words, basically means that you can replicate the file exactly to how it was before it was compressed. And the reason you can do this is because in the instances of doing the lookup tables or dictionaries, you obviously have a lookup for all the various numbers, right? So when I'm trying to decompress the file, every time I see the number 1, I know that correlates to the word the, so I can replace 1 with the word the. And then every time I see the number 2, I know that represents and, so I can replace the number 2 with the word and. And say if you're doing it phrase-based, say every time I see the phrase she said, I can replace say that's index 3. Every time I see the number 3, I can replace that with she said. And by the end of it, I will get an exact replica of what the file was before it was compressed. And this is what's known as lossless compression, or you don't lose anything. Lossless, you don't lose anything. So that's lossless compression. Now, another type of compression that's very commonly used nowadays is called lossy compression. Now, this is more commonly used for things like for images, audio files, videos, and other kinds of digital media. Now, unlike lossless compression, lossy compression, you actually do lose some of the data that was in the original version. But how the compression is done, it's meant to be done in such a way where you don't necessarily notice that data was lost during the compression. So various types of lossy compression, you can kind of think of this as your video encodings, like your H.264 and 265, various different kinds of photo encodings, like your JPEG, your PNG, your audio files, like your MP3s, M4As, ACC, etc. All those various kinds of formats are different types of lossy compression for, video, audio, and digital images and whatnot. So these algorithms, basically how they work is they remove the non-essential details that you would otherwise not notice in order to save space. Now, obviously, I think it kind of goes without saying that these algorithms are a lot more complex than your simple, I saw this word, so I'm going to replace it with this number. It's a little little bit more complex than that. But basically, the kind of the premise of how it works is, say you have a picture of a landscape, or maybe it's a portrait of you with a nature landscape in the background. So the original picture file might have incredible detail with all the blades of grass in the background. But in reality, if they're kind of all the way in the background and how you took the portrait was mainly focused on your face rather than the background in general, you're probably really not going to notice the individual blades of grass. So what the compression algorithm in this case might do is kind of smooth over those fine details of the blades of grass to make it a little more fuzzy, I guess you could say, but not necessarily to the point where you'd really notice it much. But because it's kind of reducing the number of details in those spots that you probably wouldn't notice, you're able to reduce the file size. So while you do technically lose data, in theory you don't necessarily lose quality, depending on the kind of compression you use, how much you use, and whatnot. And in extreme cases, if you ever see any kind of videos or images that look kind of blurry or fuzzy, this is generally due to an overcompression, or they just used a potato camera or potato video recorder or something like that, in which case the compression probably didn't do too much and it's just a terrible quality. But if you took something with, say, like a high resolution camera or high resolution, video recorder or whatever, and the image comes out blurry or kind of fuzzy, that's probably due to too much compression going on. So that is one thing that you can look out for. And this is kind of also why you'll notice things like JPEGs are generally a lot smaller than other image file types like PNGs, for example. Usually PNGs are bigger, but they generally have a higher quality to them. And specifically if you're looking at like bitmap images are, compared to JPEGs, pretty massive, but the quality of a bitmap image is significantly better than a JPEG because the JPEG uses so much more compression to get a much smaller file size. So that's when it comes to images. Now, when it comes to video, if you actually break down what a video is, all a video is just a sequence of images, right? So basically what you can do to compress videos is, if you see a common theme or a common feature throughout multiple frames, like say you have a stagnant background in the back, right? What you could do is you could identify that and then basically kind of remove it from, because you don't need it in every frame. If it's always constant in every single frame, you can kind of remove that from certain frames and kind of blend the backgrounds together to still have that there, but reduce the file size. So that's basically how you compress videos, is basically going through and modifying the individual images in the video. So that is also one of the reasons why, if you've ever tried to compress video or encode video, you kind of need a decent amount of horsepower on your machine if you want it to not take a bajillion years, because all the processing that has to go on in order to compress that down and reduce the file size. And then similarly, when it comes to audio files, it's kind of a similar thing where you take out stuff that people probably wouldn't notice. Now, there is lossless audio out there, which, as the name kind of implies, it's like full quality, nothing's been compressed, nothing. Obviously, the file sizes are huge, and you need to have, proper speakers or headphones to actually be able to, and proper audio equipment to actually be able to listen to that in its full quality. But the way compression of like audio files works is it'll basically take the stuff that you necessarily wouldn't notice. Like, for example, if there's frequencies in the audio track that fall outside the human range of hearing, you can just cut that out because you're not going to hear it anyway. So you can cut those frequencies out and save some space that way. So that's a super basic way of compressing audio. And also another way, depending on the algorithm, maybe if there's like some super faint or very inaudible, low volume parts of the track, maybe you kind of cut those out or something. So there's definitely different ways that you can compress audio, but definitely the easiest one would be if you see frequencies that fall outside the range of human hearing, just remove those because the humans aren't going to hear it anyway, so you can reduce the file size a little bit. So we've talked about compression, some various kinds. We've talked about the two major kinds, lossless, which basically means you can fully replicate the file once you decompress it, and then you have lossy compression, which some data is lost in the process of compressing it. So when you try to play that back or you try to view the image, it's not all the data is going to be there from the original. So those are the two main kinds. We also kind of went over the various types, like in the lossless version, that LZ adaptive dictionary-based algorithm. In the lossy versions, the various kinds of audio and video encodings and whatnot. But what are the actual use cases for compression? Now, obviously, as we kind of were touching on in the images and the lossy versions of compression, as cool as it is to have the videos and movies in their full quality, if I can basically get the same exact quality through compression and have a fraction of the file size, I will take the fraction of a file size because it's a lot easier to manage, movies that are a few gigabytes than hundreds of gigabytes for a single movie. Obviously, if you have hundreds of gigabytes for like a single movie or tens of gigabytes for a single image, you're going to run out of space a lot quicker than if you were using compression to essentially get basically the same quality for a significantly reduced file size. So it's amazing if space is a premium and you want to save space. Another reason that compression is really good is because it's excellent. It's also excellent for data hoarders that don't want to get rid of stuff, but also kind of realize they're running out of space, so they can archive the stuff so they don't have to lose it. Again, like I said, archiving, it's fantastic for archiving stuff, like things like, if you have digital records of maybe like your medical history or your taxes or something else that you don't really need on a regular basis, but you definitely don't want to lose and it's good to have around. You can compress all that stuff into a single file and have that archived. So whenever you do need it, or if you ever need it, you still have it. And then you can just decompress it to get that data back, rather than having it, take up more space than it actually needs. And on that subject, it's also great for improving file transfers. So whether you're transferring it from, say, one drive on your system to another, or you're transferring it to a USB stick, or to burning it to a CD, or you're transferring it over the network, it's a lot quicker to transfer one large file than a lot of individual smaller files, because it's a lot easier and faster to send over large blocks of data rather than a bunch of little itty-bitty ones. And if you don't believe me, then take a large folder with say a bunch of images or something, or Word documents. That's probably a better example. Take a bunch of Word documents and try to copy them, see how long it takes, and then compress all that into a single file and do the copy again. And I guarantee you the transfer speed on the single archive file that you compressed is going to be a lot quicker than copying over all the individual files. And the smaller the file size, the slower the overall speed's going to be. So if you want some improved file transfers, archiving is one way to do it, which is actually one of the reasons why I archive my NAS before I do the backup for it, because if I didn't do that, obviously it takes a while to archive the well over it, almost close to 2 terabytes at this point worth of data. It does take a while, but at the same time, if I was trying to copy all those super small files, my transfer speeds would absolutely tank. So being able to essentially sustain the full speed of the gigabit connection between my devices is going to be quicker than, the kilobits per second that I might encounter at times copying all the little itty bitty files all at once. So while it might have more overhead, it definitely does have more overhead having to archive everything, the actual transfer speed is a lot quicker. So that's another good reason for archiving stuff. And I'm trying to think if there's any other that are really good. It's basically a great way that you can, if you don't necessarily need something, or you're running out of space, or you want to transfer something quickly, it's fantastic for that. Now, there's kind of some debates out there about, which compression type is better, whether you should be using 7-zip for smaller file sizes, or whether you should be using zip files or tars or whatever the case may be. But part of it also comes down to, what are you compressing, right? Like, as I mentioned earlier in this compression discussion, depending on what you're compressing, you're not actually going to see much improvement in file size, right? Like, if, for example, if you're, like I mentioned in my use case, I'm compressing a lot of images, audio files, video files, and backups from my VMs. And as we discussed, the images, videos, and audio files are already compressed files, right? So if you try to compress something that's already compressed, there's really not much that can be done in terms of the lossless compression, because that's what I'm doing when I'm creating the tars here. It's a lossless version, so they can be fully recreated upon decompression. So if you're taking something that's already compressed and trying to make it a losslessly compressed even further, you're really not going to see much difference. So that is one thing to keep in mind if you are looking at potentially archiving stuff and compressing things, is you might not see as big of a reduction in file size as you expect, depending on what you're trying to archive. Now, with that said, as we mentioned, when it comes to transfer speeds, transferring one large file is going to be quicker than transferring a lot of smaller files. So even if you have a lot of already compressed files that are kind of smaller, that you're really not going to see much improvement in file size on by compressing it, if you compress it all into one single file, it'll be a lot quicker to move that file around to, external drives, or transferring over the network, or what have you. So it is definitely something to consider. It's not like just because you want to compress a folder, you're gonna, immediately, cut out like 50 gigabytes or something like that. Like, that, it's a little bit unrealistic. But depending on what you are compressing, you can see some pretty significant gains, or I guess reductions, in file size. But it really kind of depends on what you're trying to compress, and then potentially to a lesser extent, the file format you're using for the compression and the compression algorithm. But honestly, any of the ones that we've kind of talked about here are going to do a pretty good job when it comes to reducing your file size, assuming that you're compressing stuff that can be compressed. But if you really want to get into the weeds, by all means, go look at comparisons, have multiple archive programs installed on your computer, and compare them and see which one works for you. Because chances are, depending on what kind of files you're compressing, one compression algorithm might work really good for one folder you have on your machine, but then another folder with different files, maybe that that first algorithm doesn't work as good on the second one. So it's definitely something to play around with and to see which one works best for you. But at the end of the day, I mean, still having one file that you can easily transfer around as an archive is definitely a lot easier to manage and a lot faster to move around, as I said, than a bunch of little ones. So that's kind of the wild world of compression. It's definitely something that's really cool. So if you're out there looking for a personal programming project, how about you write your own compression algorithm? Not necessarily a lossy compression algorithm for images and videos, unless you're an absolute mad lad, in which case, by all means, go for it. But start with something, more simple, right? Start with one of those like dictionary-based compression algorithms where you read in a file, you look through it, find the common words, and replace them with, say, numbers, and then export that, and boom, you wrote your own compression algorithm. So if you're looking for a cool project to impress some people, there you go. So that is going to do it for this episode, but we're not quite done yet because we still have to answer our trivia question for the week. So if you'll recall, in the spirit of talking about compression, the zip file format is probably one of the most common when it comes to compression. And what year was the zip file format released? And if you said 1989, congratulations, you are correct. And if you're an absolute baller and said February 14th, 1989, bonus points for you. So congratulations if you got that right. 1989, kind of a little bit ago. So congratulations if you got that right. Been around a little bit, but that is going to do it for this episode. So if you enjoyed it, I ask that you leave it a rating and review and subscribe to the Dark Assassins podcast if you haven't done so already. And be sure to share this episode with a friend or family member, maybe someone that wants to learn about compression. Or if you want to make them stay to the end to learn about the programming project idea of writing their own compression algorithm, there's one for you. And if you have any questions about this episode or have any comments or questions for future episodes, shoot me an email at contact@darkassassinsinc.com. The link is down in the show notes below. And that's going to do it for me in this episode of the Dark Assassins podcast. Until next time, my fellow assassins, remember, bool nothing equals true. If action not equal to null, return true. I'll see you next time on the Dark Assassins podcast.